Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted so many of you here this morning for what I hope is going to be one of the media events of the year. This is a conversation with three of our most esteemed journalists. Delighted this morning that we have got Ken Reid, former political editor of Ulster Television, uh, Tommy Gorman, who was former Northern editor with RTE, and of course, Mark Devonport, who was the political editor with the BBC, still occasionally on air, I see. I'm especially delighted that we've got Tara Mills to host and manage this conversation over the next hour and a half or so. We will be recording this, so it will be available afterwards. And we will provide an opportunity, obviously, for you to ask questions of our guests. So please use the chat facility, and we will sort of fire those questions to Tara. So anyway, you didn't pay to come and hear me. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tara, who will manage the session. Thank you.
David, thanks very much indeed. You didn't pay to hear me either, but I would like to say one quick thing at the very beginning. I can't think of anywhere else that has such experience. Three political editors who covered the whole story from start to finish. And to have them here today, I think we're really fortunate. I'm really looking forward to talking to them. But I would also like to say I've worked with all three, sort of either as a colleague with Mark or as somebody out on the road with Ken and Tommy. And, you know, they couldn't have been more supportive or generous with their time, with their expertise of somebody kind of running along in their coattails trying to get snippets of information. So they're three big beasts, but they're very friendly and kind and generous beasts, and we're delighted to have them here today. So, and also to everybody watching, I'm sure everybody's exhausted. I know everybody here is probably feeling it as well. COVID has just brought us all into a completely different kind of area of work, and everybody's had to change their way of working. So just a big shout out to everybody who's watching as well, who's had to work so hard over the last 18 months. So let's get underway. I think that let's just start big, will we? Just tell us the biggest political event. Mark, I'll start with you. I mean, there are so many, it must be almost impossible to pin down, but was there a moment in the peace process, or perhaps slightly before the peace process, or since the peace process, that you've thought, that's it, I cannot believe this has happened, and here we are?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's great to be here. I'm aware that I've been described as a giant and big on several occasions. Anyone who knows me knows that that's against the Trades Descriptions Act. You know, it's been quite a ride, I think, for all three of us. We've all got memories of what it was like during the Troubles, and then during the whole peace process, and then the complexity of trying to make the power-sharing executive work. I would say probably, if you would have to say what's one big event, even though it was a process and a whole series of things, I would say probably the 1994 IRA ceasefire stands out in my mind, because that was the time when things changed. And in the run-up to that, there was still, you know, the distinct possibility that all this talk of ceasefire was an ephemeral thing. We had Christmas ceasefires before then. This might not last. We might simply lapse back into what we had. Now, we did lapse back in terms of the Docklands bombing, but there was, I think, a feeling around the 1994 ceasefire that somehow something big had changed and we were now on a new trajectory in Northern Ireland. And that was almost a feeding through of changes internationally. We'd seen the Berlin Wall come down. We'd seen things that we couldn't imagine happen. And we were now on a new trajectory. Now, there was a lot of problems further down the road. We had the Oman bombing, lots of problems before the Good Friday Agreement. But if I was to look at what changed the kind of trajectory of my career and the trajectory of Northern Ireland, it was that move from constant conflict to this kind of imperfect peace. And that was probably the moment when we had a quick change in direction, which, whilst, as I say, it was problematic, was historic and massive. And it was pretty clear from that point on that we were into a kind of a peace process strategy. So I think that also changed the nature of the kind of work we did, from being ambulance chasers to being sort of stalwart Kremlinologists looking at the niceties of whatever was going on.
Thank you. That's really interesting, because you sort of maybe assume that people will say the Good Friday Agreement, so it's really interesting. Tommy, for you, whenever you look back at your career, what is the one moment that you think, yeah, there was a feeling that I had in my belly or in my head or in my heart that just, I thought, right, this is actually going to happen. This is going to change.
I'm from Sligo, close to the border. And I remember 40 years ago, one Easter, two young boys were killed in Derry, James Brown, Gary English. I remember coming up to cover that story, and I thought I had arrived in the middle of Vietnam. And as I was setting out this morning from Sligo at 6:30, passing by Arlene Foster's door, wondering was she up at around 8 o'clock, travelling through Northern Ireland, each time I make a journey like that, each time I see my friends again, I just become so conscious of the transformation that has taken place in this society. I think we were all hammered emotionally by the killing that was going on for a period of our lives. And now to be able to be in this imperfect peace, as Mark described it, that goes from speed bump to speed bump, from slow down to slow down, but where the killing has stopped, I'm always struck. I always get energy, Tara, from seeing the place early in the morning, at peace, people going about their work. And that's the sense I had when I came here today. Also have to say, when I walk in and I see David Sterling, I thought it was his son. You know, he looks so young. And I say the thing the three of us have in common, and David, is that we're retired. But I like to think that we're still interested in the place, that we're still invested in it. And although I'm back living south of the border, I have to say that I'll have an affinity with this place until the day I die, because I feel it's a story of the triumph of the human spirit at the end of the day.
Yeah. And did you think we could have ever, you know, when you started out on your career, could you see an end to the Troubles? Could you see a peace process?
Well, I worked in the Northwest for 9 years, but after that I went to Brussels for 12. And I was in Europe during those times of momentous change. And I saw what happened when wealth was spread from the richer areas to the poorer areas. And the way if you give people jobs and you give them a buy-in to society, you give them hope. So then I came back for the last 20 years with that European experience. And in some respects, I feel that European example, which Hume spotted, I felt it was such an important template for Northern Ireland. I suppose that's what saddened me about Brexit, that whole element in Northern Ireland's success, that it was almost jettisoned by Brexit. And I think it's still struggling with that.
Yeah. We'll come on to that, I'm sure, a little later on. Ken, what about you? When it comes to those dark days of the Troubles, and then on to the political achievements that we've seen over the past 25, 30 years, you know, what stands out for you?
I started as a news reporter in the newsletter in 1977. It was a grim time. It was basically reporting. I remember something that stood out in my career was Warren Point. I remember the situation arriving there with a photographer called Randall Mulligan, being there very quick, because it was the time, there wasn't 24-hour news in those days, but very quick, and seeing something that to this day still haunts me in terms of the carnage. I move on. I went to Cork in 1987 for 7 years, and I was starting to cover politics from the southern perspective. And something stood out in my time in Cork, which was the Downing Street Declaration. And at that time, perhaps I was travelling with the Irish government and trips and so forth, and I got to know particularly the civil servants. And at that stage, I was probably quite cynical about whether there could be peace in this part of the world. But a lot of the people you don't see behind the scenes, the civil servants, you know, we're talking to at the moment, there was a degree of optimism. And then I came back just before the IRA ceasefire, and I remember at one of my farewell parties, which was actually in Dublin, a very senior member of the Department of Foreign Affairs saying to me, "Ken, I assure you, you're doing the right thing going back. There's going to be peace." I still wasn't sure, but then the IRA ceasefire. And the event that stands out for me was Bill Clinton coming I know it was just Christmas, although it was actually in November, but I felt at that stage it was unstoppable. There would be setbacks. There would be various other things. You could also see the violence was starting to come down. And one of the things I learned about that is, yes, this is a very small part of the world. We do need outside help. It's just the fact of the way that we are constructed. We can be very insular. People come here and say, oh, we're very friendly. Yeah, well, maybe we are, but sometimes we're not very friendly to each other. But I felt there was a momentum. People were interested. The fact that the President of the United States was interested, I found that was a remarkable thing. The ceasefire. And when you were talking to people behind the scenes, you realised there was a momentum. There was always a problem getting unionists on board because they saw that as a threat to the status quo. But with people like Trimble and those around, you could see there was movement. So really, it's been a tremendous journey for all three of us. And I know that we get very depressed and things are difficult at the moment, but my goodness, it's quite a change from when I started as a reporter in 1977.
Yeah. And, Ken, I'll go the other way around now and stay with you for the minute. When it comes to effective political leaders during that time and since, you don't have the constraints of the editorial of UTV now, who stands out for you? Who do you think, I'm sure it's not just one person, but just describe to us your sense of how we did achieve that with political leadership here in Northern Ireland?
John Hume. I remember, Tommy would remember going with John Hume to Strasbourg. Tommy was there. This was the early 90s. The first thing was the interaction between John Hume and even the other unionist MEPs, which was impressive. David Trimble takes great credit. I mean, David Trimble took a risk, and it was against his natural instinct. Seamus Mallon, I think, also. In terms of Blair and Bertie Ahern, Albert Reynolds, John Major also. Major was the first British Prime Minister I felt that really took an interest and could see there was going to have to be a change to get this violence stopped. But above them all, I think John Hume was the one that had the vision. And people talk about the single transferable speech. Yeah, but he was right.
Yeah. And I suppose in a way, that kind of ties in with what we have now, which is that the importance of communication and the importance of communicating a single, idea or a single sense of something.
Yeah, well, I go back to after the Good Friday Agreement, and George Mitchell said that was the easy bit, and that's proved to be the case. And there's things that you didn't think about perhaps in 1998, the demographic change, other aspects, the world's changing. And I suppose we've arrived at a situation that is a political crisis at the moment. But on the plus side, really, I mean, violence is not here. The place is at peace. It's got to get the politics sorted out.
Yeah. Tommy, what about you when it comes to those kind of political leaders? And maybe just change that slightly. Who do you think could have performed better? Could have tried to bring their kind of constituency with them a bit better, could have taken more risks?
Politics is a really difficult trade. You have to put yourself before the electorate every few years in order to survive. You look at, say, the DUP at the moment and the positions Jeffrey Donaldson is taking. He's doing that in order to try and keep the DUP the largest party. Because a bit like our own business, if you don't have a job, you're not on air. So they have to stay above the surface. So I don't think you can say your man should have done it differently or your woman should have done it differently. And I'd agree with Ken that Hume provided the template. But if you didn't get Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness to buy into it, the IRA wouldn't have stopped. And unfortunately, stopping the violence was the essential part of the whole equation. On the other side of the line, for David Trimble, it was very, very uncomfortable territory. And you could see he was afraid of being duped. And you could see that the DUP were going to exploit any sign of weakness because it's competitive. So actually, Tara, they all play a role in one way or another. And if you move it forward to more modern times, I think the advance we've seen in the last decade is how the society here has started to change dramatically. You look at, say, gay rights. You look at the role that somebody like Lyra McKee had in that, how she found space in a unionist community and she found space in a nationalist community where she reached out to that sector who felt that, they weren't getting a fair shakeout. And then, the magic that happened, I thought it was a wonderful interaction of modern times and politics, that when you had in St. Anne's Cathedral, you had a Catholic priest lecturing all the political classes about not having power sharing and up and running, and not having stormont in action. So there you had this grassroots movement, which I suppose in some respects is epitomised by the role the Alliance Party has been playing. You had, say, this gay rights issue that sort of gave a voice to the likes of Lyra McKee. What happened to her was such a dreadful tragedy, such a terrible way to die. But then you had a Catholic priest in a Protestant church getting the political class to move. And I think that's another story of the Northern Ireland dynamic.
Yeah, Martin Gill did such a phenomenal job, most people would say that day. Mark, you're slightly more constrained, I accept, because you're still on our airwaves. But yeah, come on. You're among friends. Who stands out for you in terms of the political leadership?
Well, I would concur with Ken that I think that John Hume had the big picture and drew on what he'd learned from Europe in order to come up with this sort of extraordinary template whereby it wasn't a case of doing away with the border altogether, but making it mean less and less and investing much more responsibility in the notion of people's identity rather than just a piece of turf and the old battle that we'd seen over 4 green fields, which it was always hard to resolve if it remained just a territorial battle. So he came up with that, and he came up with a lot of what was then incorporated into the Good Friday Agreement, the whole idea of having referenda on both sides of the border and so on, in order to give people who had said that the Irish people are not allowed to have their will expressed, give them a vehicle to say, oh, this is the way it's been expressed. So I think he's got the big picture, and David Trimble then has got the big risk-taking ability. If one was to say, where did they fail? Where did they fall short? They fell short on those kind of detailed skills of party management, of making all their acolytes feel special and have special jobs to do. And I always think that possibly Jeffrey Donaldson could have been managed in a different way, and he might have been playing a different role. And one person who I think did have that grasp of the issues and then did also have an ability to manage things was Tony Blair. He has come in for lots of negative publicity in relation to the Iraq War and his policies there later on in his period of power. But one can't fail both him and Bertie Ahern for the assiduous nature in which they just devoted every bit of time they had available. In many ways, it was extraordinary that the doors of Downing Street were always constantly open to our politicians. But he, I think, realised that this was big picture stuff and that you had to give it the time and the detail. It was often amazing when you got to interview Tony Blair that he didn't put a foot wrong in relation to Northern Ireland. That was because he was aware of the sensitivities in relation to the details. So perhaps if the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists had people who had fulfilled that kind of party management role and that detail role, they may not have necessarily succumbed to either wing. What was the other bit of your question?
Yeah, well, I mean, by the same token, did anybody fail in that? Which you've answered that.
That there were failures, and also, I mean, taking it away from individuals, I think there are often failures. Quite often, we've got a situation in Northern Ireland where people go for the short-term goal as opposed to the long-term situation. So you will see right now, probably in the debates that we're having coming up about Brexit and the protocol and the future of Northern Ireland, I'm sure on the unionist side, you'll see a lot of criticism of anybody like the Alliance Party who's prepared to contemplate working with the protocol as being Lundies and sellouts. But then there's a kind of a dichotomy there because, of course, they need those kind of floating voters in the middle of Northern Ireland in order to keep Northern Ireland afloat,
Yeah.
should we ever get to a border poll. And that's often a difficulty, I think, with unionism, that there's a tendency just to do what will please the grassroots, allegedly, but then potentially not make it a welcoming place for the numbers of people who they need to keep alongside them. So, there are failings. I wouldn't want to necessarily personalise those.
But yeah, I suppose it's hard to, some people have said it's like herding cats trying to keep unionists together anyway, and we see that with the kind of splintering of all the different political parties and even within the church, even within the Orange Order. So I suppose it was always going to be quite difficult to keep that party unity, perhaps in a way that the SDLP and Sinn Féin were able to do more successfully.
Well, although the SDLP and Ken and others will tell you that
yeah.
quite often that seemed to be a series of different little sort of baronial estates. But then, and that's maybe one of the reasons why they had a problem, because they were up against such a centralised party as Sinn Féin.
Yeah.
In relation to that, Tara, I remember Mullen saying once that when she reflected on the Good Friday Agreement, that the missing part of the jigsaw was the DUP.
Yes.
She felt that just the equation wouldn't work without DUP participation. And that happened. And when you talk about magic moments, I think Devolution Day, when McGuinness and Paisley and Blair and Bertie Ahern came down the steps in Stormont, that was a magic day. And where I saw it find expression, I remember going on a trip, it was Christmas, I think, 2007, with Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness to New York. And they were box office. Yeah. Everyone wanted to talk to them. And I think that was probably the high point of innocence. I think Jerry Moriarty, who retires today from the Irish Times, I think he coined the phrase the Chuckle Brothers from that period. And I think that was just a time of utter magic, when everything seemed possible. And of course, then the practicalities kicked in. But I think, the involvement of the DUP to make the Good Friday Agreement power sharing work, I think that was essential.
Because, I was going to say, you've sort of preempted me slightly, I'll come to you now, Ken, is that Ian Paisley's the one name that wasn't mentioned until now. So, I think that's quite interesting in itself, but perhaps people would say it was easier for him because he came in much later on. But it was still a huge...
But certainly Ian Paisley's journey was a remarkable one. But you were talking about failings there, and I think some of the blame for failings and times when we get into trouble really rests with the governments. When the two governments take their eye off the ball, I think this place gets into trouble. I mean, Tommy talked about Mo Moran there. Mo Moran, I remember, went to Peter Robinson's house at that time a lot to talk to him. She, as Tommy said, she realised the DP had to be on board. There are times when I felt, particularly in London and to Dublin to a degree, that they felt things were settled, they could sort that out themselves. That has not been the case. And if you go through some of the secretaries of state and others that we've had, you've got to say, well, were they taking this place seriously or not? And how high was it on their agenda? I would be over in Westminster quite a bit, and you get absolutely frustrated, saying, like, there's a major problem coming, you need to do something, and it wasn't happening. So I think there were failings on the two governments at various times in the process. Isn't it interesting that Stormont came back together when Simon Coveney and Julian Smith got their act together and provided a document and forced them back into Stormont? I have to say, being fair, Peter Hain did the same thing in 2007. And that was the Ian Paisley, Martin McGuinness event.
There have been so many huge moments, you kind of try to go through them. David, I just wonder, could we bring you in at that point just to talk about those effective political leaders, and from a kind of civil service, public service point of view, how important is it that you have those key big thinkers, somebody that can look beyond the next election, somebody that can see the big picture? How important is it for you to function then and have that sort of relationship with the political leaders?
It's hugely important, and I think... when you look back over the history, and it's interesting to hear the three views there, but the Good Friday Agreement gave us something that was designed primarily to get parties working together who had been opposed, even violently opposed in the past. It wasn't primarily designed to deliver good government. And that has been one of our problems, is that it has got the parties together, but we still haven't seen delivery for the citizens in the way in which I think people are now, the sort of type of delivery, the type of outcomes that people are now needing. And it's an extraordinary arrangement, which I think history shows has needed extraordinary leaders to actually make it work.
Yeah.
And, I'm not going to comment on individuals or personalities, but I think, there is no doubt that there is a need for strong leadership, and there's a need for people who, as in the past, took risks because they saw better outcomes for citizens at the end of it. And I think if we're to progress further from where we've got to, we're going to need to see that type of leadership again. We're going to need to see people who are prepared to take risks, because otherwise I think we will end up in this sort of spiral that we're in at the moment.
And potential unravelling. And is there a sense, do you take Ken's point that the two governments are still so important? And in a way, if you kind of look at the Good Friday Agreement as the birth of a, Stormont and a new regime, that we haven't quite come of age to let them go off into the big wide world on their own?
Yeah, and one of the pleasures of my job, or one of the privileges, was I got to travel widely. So London, Dublin, Brussels, Washington. But one of the things that I would have seen over the years was a sense, when you were speaking to people outside of here, that we thought everything was sorted out. And, when you talk to people elsewhere, they all have their problems. Northern Ireland is not the only thing that preoccupies people elsewhere. So the sense I got as time went by was that patience with Northern Ireland would sort of wear thin a little bit after the while, and that, perhaps we needn't always expect that outsiders will come to our aid. But I agree with Ken, indeed Tommy and Mark, that when things do go wrong here, it has been outsiders that have helped us to get through it, and we will probably need that again. And I want to pay tribute to Julian Smith, who I think was quite remarkable, ably assisted by Simon Coveney. I'm not sure that anybody that I've worked with in terms of political leaders would have got NDNA over the line in the way that Julian did.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I know,
Indeed.
yeah. But it's interesting. I suppose it's those personal relationships are actually
Yes.
so key. The Simon Coveney and Julian Smith, Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair. That kind of obviously seems to be so key to
Yes.
how we progress. I have a quick question just that I'll ask the panel here. Anne Williamson from the Department of Economy. Thanks, Anne. Who do you see as the leader of tomorrow? Who will represent the youth? Mark.
Who will represent the youth? Well, it depends a bit in terms of, and I think David was alluding to it there, whether we continue with this system or not. It's a very clunky system, and I think that the system probably is getting near breaking point. And if you're talking about the youth, you are talking increasingly, I think, about people who want to, not all of them, but a lot of them in terms of the younger generation want to break out of the kind of labels that they've been given in terms of the way that Stormont works, the nationalist unionist designations and so on. So who represents the youth? I see some people coming through there, particularly in the centre ground parties, the likes of Kate Nicholl, the current Lord Mayor of Belfast, who I find, their whole approach to politics quite refreshing. It's not necessarily because it's the Alliance Party, but it's just that whole business, whether it's the Greens, the Alliance, or others within the major parties who are, developing views and putting them out there on things like climate change, on those bigger issues that we are going to face, irrespective of what happens to the border in the future.
Yeah.
So, we are seeing some people coming through in our councils, maybe less so in the Assembly. And that's where I sort of take heart. But at the moment, we're still in a situation where we could be, because of the fragility over the protocol, we could be kind of battened back down into those designations, which in some ways will be a bit of a shame.
Yeah. Tommy, what about you?
I'll answer Anne's question in what I think is a pertinent way. I think the big political question for the next 2-3 years is what's going to happen to Sinn Féin. 40 years since the hunger strike, the beginning of Sinn Féin as a modern political movement, could be the largest party in Northern Ireland after the next Assembly elections. What will that do to unionism? How will unionism respond? And then, of course, they're an all-island party. They were the largest party in the Republic, vote-wise, after the last general election, but they're not in government. I think they're on course to be the largest party again. And I'd say it'll be a struggle to keep them out of government because people would see a certain element of unfairness if things are carved up to keep them out. So I think in the next 2-3 years, you're going to see Sinn Féin as a party of government, north and south, tested. And this has been coming since partition in the Republic. It was a factor throughout the Troubles. Once the Armalite was put to one side and the ballot box became the area of activity, there was an inevitability about this. So to answer Anne's question, I think before you can see a younger generation move in, Sinn Féin as a political force are going to be stress tested on both sides of the border. And God knows how that is going to play into the overall political dynamic.
Picking up just on what Tommy was saying there, I think there's a story in the papers today about Sinn Féin putting forward their proposals for an NHS-style health service in the South. And if we're looking towards the kind of debates we may have in the future, that's going to be huge in relation to a border pull. And can they, if they are in government in the South, prove that they're up to both running things in the South and also creating a society that might appeal to people who might at least consider constitutional change in the future. And that sort of thing will be a debate that we'll no doubt have.
Probably Jeffrey Donaldson's first day as leader is facing that scenario, that it's quite likely that Sinn Féin could be the largest party, both north and south of the border. And that's quite a challenge at the moment. Yeah.
And Tara, there's no plan. There's part of the debate was very interesting about how the structures that were put in place in Northern Ireland were to try to get these parties to get on together and to stop violence. It wasn't going to couldn't guarantee efficient government because it's a mandatory coalition. And there's no master plan for this. And we sometimes don't give politicians the credit for keeping it afloat and civil servants for keeping that system afloat. Say, for instance, in journalism, we look to the government and opposition model. That's the only one we know. And sometimes people are expecting that kind of activity here. You know, the Punch and Judy radio format of, say, the Nolan programme. That's another manifestation of it. And in the same way, as there was no template for here, this is completely new political science. It's going to be the very same with Sinn Féin. They've never done this before on both sides of the border. And they're going to be tested like never before. And if they come through it, they'll be a success. But if they fail, they'll be thrown out.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, Ken? Because it sort of feels almost as if we're just at the cusp of another. I know the protocol is one thing, but it feels like we're on the cusp of something much, much bigger here.
Yeah, it's huge. And I think something probably we're going to talk about Brexit comes into this. If you look, to go back to the point about perhaps young people coming through, I think the last number of elections have been significant. The European election, the Alliance Party coming in, Naomi Long. Also the council elections, again, increased. And I do think that a lot of young people who have probably identify themselves as Northern Irish are looking towards the Alliance Party, the Green Party, parties of the centre. And I think there's a recognition in both the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists that they need those people as well. And I think that's being reflected in their policy.
They need to tackle those issues.
They need to tackle those things.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the rise of really the centre ground could take them out.
Yeah.
And isn't it true as well, Ken, that it's not young people as personalities, but young people's ideas, Tara. That's the factor.
Yeah.
That's the new energy in politics now.
And we're
seeing,
we're seeing that in the Greens in the South, even in Germany this week, you know, such a seismic number of votes in the Green Party in Germany that was completely unexpected.
Now, of course, in the past, the Alliance Party have threatened to break through and then collapsed. So it's still a big challenge for them. And I think that's quite a task facing their leadership. And the question you would ask, do the Alliance Party have enough people coming through in terms of frontline politicians to actually make the breakthrough? Are they in the game enough? I mean, can you name 6 Alliance Party politicians? All the sort of things that I know that they're probably looking at themselves. I cannot really overstress the importance of this next election coming, because I think that is going to define where we're going. And the aftermath of that, I expect, will be another process, a process of some sort, because I think that the makeup is changing. I go back to the fact the demographics of Northern Ireland are changing.
Yeah.
The census will be released next year. We'll see. It'll not be just for now, but it'll be the trend for the years ahead. That will be every bit as important. People who are under 25, what's the breakdown there? All that is going into the mix. And I know that the audience here, civil servants, local government, well, I have to say, in terms of the future, I don't think the politics is going to be any more stable than it has been in recent years. Sorry to put that. I think the next year is vitally important.
Yeah.
I would imagine when the election, I still think the election will be in May, by the way, whether Donaldson walks out or not, because you come to the situation, well, he said it'll be November. Stormont rises in March anyway. What's the point of having an early election unless Jeffrey Donaldson's done some deal with Boris Johnson? That's one of the other things at the moment which slightly depresses me. I don't detect any great interest in the British government in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
I know Boris Johnson at the moment is playing lip service about the protocol. But if you consider Karen Brad was Secretary of State, I'm not particularly impressed with the current Secretary of State in terms of his knowledge of what's going on. I wouldn't say that new TV. I wouldn't have said that new TV.
What Ken
That's
is
our
saying
scoop.
is that our successors ought to have their flasks packed and maybe a few
sleeping bag.
sandwiches, a few sleeping bags to be there, and sort of, at least it would be June, which is not as bad as, because normally it was always constructed for November and December when we were engaged in
Jim
talks.
Dougal used to say, you know, we've been at some of the nicest buildings in the world and we stood outside. But I remember that Dan Mulhall said, you know, there's only one thing worse than standing outside an Anglo-Irish summit as being in one. So.
But he should try it the other way around.
I just think, I mean, for the benefit of the audience, you know, I just would like to touch on the relationship with public servants that you've all had to build up to a greater or lesser extent. But David, I'll throw this one to you as well and let the others have a think about it. When it comes to the other side of that then, how best would you advise future public servants, current public servants, to build up those relationships, to try to cut through the noise, to get that message out there so that journalists understand the process and perhaps explain it to the public better than perhaps sometimes we've done in the past?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think it is important that there's a good relationship between the public service, the civil service, local government, arm's length bodies, and the media, such that whenever something goes wrong, journalists know who they can speak to find out what's really happened here. You know, obviously as a public servant, you have to be careful in terms of how you engage with the media, particularly if you've got political masters. But certainly my view was always we should make sure, working through our press offices, that we have got good relationships, that people know who they should speak to when something goes wrong. So as I say, there is that understanding of just how things work and why something has maybe, what are the real reasons why something has gone wrong.
Interesting. What about you, Mark? When it comes to those slightly different relationships, for the benefit of the audience, you know, how do you build up those relationships? Because the press office always feels like the kind of first point of call and it's difficult to get behind that.
Well, I mean, I think we would all be in a situation where, yeah, there's a role for the press office and press officers, but quite often if it's a fast-moving story, you're ending up trying to go through to the primary sources who are either the political leaders or in some cases senior officials in order to establish what's going on. You may very well, for instance, get a breaking story from a source that has an obvious political interest in that story breaking, but it's important to then be able to touch base with somebody to find out, is this true? And if it is true, what's the context for this? So you don't just simply run straight onto air with a partial account. And we have all done it in a situation in which time is of the essence, you know? So sometimes if we've only been able to get what we think might be a partial version, we may have ended up going on air, but with a lot of caveats or whatever. But yeah, I think the whole relationship between journalists and politicians has changed in the course of our careers. I think in the earlier part of our careers, you would simply ring up the local politician directly, arrange where you'll be going to interview them. And then suddenly when they started getting office people, I remember there was one day when Stormont was sort of first stood up and there was a line of sort of half a dozen people introducing themselves to us. I'm the assistant to the assistant to the minister. And you go, but I've known the minister for the last 15 years. Why do I want to go through the assistant to the assistant to the assistant? But, some of that was inevitable, I suppose, with people getting responsibility and there's a role for it. But you also, ultimately, you need people who are in the know, and you need people who you can trust. Not always the same people, but if you can put the jigsaw together between them, then you're getting close to it.
I think we probably should send an apology to press officers. Very often we just ignore them. I mean, why would you talk to a press officer when you can talk to the main character? And also because we were in constant political crisis, it was the politicians who were our main source. Now, I think that if you had a system in Stormont that was settled down, well, that could change. And being fair, there's some very talented people in the press offices that I've come across that I would phone and give me, because I could rely on their information. And the good ones understood what the role of the journalist was. That's important. Where I felt that there was also a degree of naivety in a lot of them. But the difficulty being...
The last thing you want to have is a political argument with somebody about a point where they think that you're putting forward a point of view, whereas your point of view is, I am on air in 10 minutes' time. That's your main point of view, and I need that bit of information. It's going to go out one way or the other. You can waste my time here, or you can find it out from another source.
I can talk to the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister directly. Why would I talk to a press officer?
I found at times, Tara, that the civil service here, that it was inhibited by a sense of being the branch office. That they saw themselves as not really the fellows who made the decisions, that they were depending on Westminster. Also found at times that there was a Northern Ireland attitude to it. It wasn't, say, as open to North-South theory at times. It was kind of wary of being that. And I found there were a fair few talented people in it who were frustrated by those restrictions and who were trying to, to drive on. And I think all of those things are understandable because of, say, the artificial nature of some of the structures. But I'll give you an example of how good it can be. Say, during the pandemic, you had Robin Swan, who had given up the ghost as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, was gone. Was looking forward to being an MLA and doing whatever one does with the life. The next thing, there's a rearrangement and there's the poison chalice of health. So he gets the job. And the next thing, there's a pandemic. So he hasn't just got the job, he's got the job, the biggest one of all. And when you talk about people who've been a success, he's a shining example so far. And he would not be that success if he didn't have David Gordon in his press office. He's probably the most competent fella I've seen in my years here in that role.
Poacher turned gamekeeper then.
Yeah, unreal.
If he's watching.
And vicious in the way he protects his ministry.
Absolutely.
Because one of the other aspects I feel must be frustrating for civil servant press officers is all the political parties have their own press officers. And I think that particularly both the DUP and Sinn Féin do infringe on the territory that probably should be the...
it's a nightmare for them.
It's a nightmare for them. I can imagine that some of the tensions that we didn't see are probably fairly remarkable.
I mean, David, this... I mean, it's interesting because we were talking about the kind of political structures and maybe not being mature enough to run on its own. I mean, is there a sense that the civil service still has some way to go, as Tommy said, feeling like the branch office of Westminster? Does there need to be kind of a maturing of the system here as well?
I think I'd recognise what Tommy said going back, 10 or years or so ago. But actually, I think one of the things that we missed over the last 10 years or so was we grew apart from Whitehall and elsewhere.
Okay.
We became, we were working for ministers who wanted to find Northern Ireland solutions to Northern Ireland problems, which is great. But I think some of the relationships that we would have had with people in Whitehall departments weren't as strong as they might have been in the past. And that meant that we didn't have the access to the thinking that was maybe going on about how you would deal with a particular problem or challenge.
Okay.
So I think we maybe became a little bit inward looking, and I think there's a recognition, and I don't really want to get into a discussion about RHI, but there's no doubt that one of the challenges we face here is it requires as much effort to devise a policy for 1.9 million people as it does for 50 or 60 million people. And perhaps one of the things that in government we need to do is to be more outward looking when it comes to designing policy solutions, not always feeling that we have the answers ourselves. And, I think that probably requires a change in mindset. But I think one of the things the public service needs to do here, and we've had discussions about this recently, is a bit more movement in and out of the civil service into perhaps other civil services, into local government, that sort of thing. And I think that could only be good in terms of just broadening the mindset of public servants generally.
Interesting. Let's move on to social media and radio talk shows. Tommy, you've already touched on this. How did that change your world and the broadcasting world and the media generally, particularly, I suppose, Twitter, because, you go from trying to get it on your next radio bulletin or television bulletin, and then it goes Twitter first. How has that changed? How did that change your career? Or did it?
Well, I'm old-fashioned in that I don't tweet because I think as sure as you tweet, you're going to screw up every so often and bring trouble on yourself. I was on Facebook for a very short period and got off that. And I always felt that if I wanted to break a story, the place to do it was on your website or on your bulletins. And fortunately, RTE let me away with that attitude. But there's no doubt about it that consciousness of social media and what's being said and the way people can mount a campaign in social media, it becomes a pressure point. The churn is different. The 24-hour news cycle is so different as well. It's just going constantly. And I suppose one of the new rules is that if you can survive for 24 or 48 or 72 hours, it'll probably go away in most cases. So it's a completely different dynamic. And as for the situation on the ground here and what's important, I think by far the biggest influence in Northern Ireland journalism at the moment is Stephen Nolan. He has access to television. He has access to radio 5 days a week. And then at the weekend, he's on 5 Live. And he brings back some stuff from 5 Live or brings over some stuff. So he has enormous influence. And I found it fascinating that the DUP, having boycotted him for a while, Sinn Féin are doing it now, but the DUP having boycotted him, somehow Jeffrey Donaldson's big speech that he was making about his plans, that it was timed for a 9:30 start. Now, there's a coincidence. So I think that's a big change here.
Yeah. And do you think, has it, people sometimes have said, if a programme like Stephen Nolan's was around when the Good Friday Agreement was being signed, it wouldn't have been signed. Do you agree with that?
Well, what do you think? Because you work, say, within the BBC and he's on his BBC invention. But it's certainly...
Well, I'm old enough to remember when he was on other airwaves,
UTV. Yeah, he was on UTV.
Okay, what do you think?
Yeah, he's certainly an enormous power. There's no question about it. But on the social media, I was an enthusiastic tweeter when I was in political editor. And one of the nicest things, and I tweet very little now, and I find that a relief, actually, because I do think that it attracts all sorts of people. And at many times, it's an open sewer.
Yeah.
It really is. Against that, I think it's changed the nature of journalism. And the fact there's very few exclusives now that you would break on a standard news program or a newspaper. Everything seems to emerge in either Twitter or, well, it's Twitter. It's seldom on Facebook. And I mean, I do Facebook at the moment, but I do music and things like that on it. I don't go into politics at all. And actually, that's one of the reliefs I found about retirement, because things would come back at you, Twitter. There's no question about that. And I know Mark and myself have both an enormous number of followers. In many ways, we should all go away. But, having said that, yeah, Stephen Nolan's very powerful at the moment. Very.
Well, I would stand up for Stephen Nolan in as much as, look at what he did in relation to the RHI. That was partly a spotlight investigation, but it was also, an extraordinary program which I participated, where Johnny Bell went public in relation to that, and we ended up with an inquiry. So, I mean, I do think that systems of government have got to be robust enough, at least, to be able to cope with the fact that, radio talk shows exist in this society as in others. I don't necessarily, if you were to compare and contrast inside politics, which I presented for a long time, the Stephen Nolan show, I've obviously got a different style, but I think that there are horses for courses. And I think that our parties, this whole business of boycotting, especially when you're holding positions of responsibility in society, I don't think it's very mature. And I think that they will find now that, even if the Nolan show was to go away tomorrow, we're now in a situation where people are used to holding people to account, be it through social media or traditional media. And, that is going to carry on. And people have got to be robust about this and expect that if they put a foot wrong, that they will be held to account. Yeah,
it's also the case, I think, for the civil servants, that if you're afraid of Stephen Nolan, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That you have to address that Stephen Nolan's pursuing an agenda. He wants to know what's going on. And if you're running away or afraid, there'll be a suspicion there. I think that government departments need to take that on board, not just with Stephen Nolan, but with other programmes as well.
And a lot of this stuff which you're either hearing on Stephen Nolan's show or you're reading on Twitter was going on anyway. Yeah. I mean, I can recall back in the old days, and I started working in Belfast in '86, and the phone would be going, and sometimes it would be the Woodstock Road Tartan gang phoning from a kiosk saying we're having a riot. I'd say, hope you enjoy yourself. There was one time when I picked up a phone and somebody said, I want to complain about the number of Englishmen on the news. And because we were short of staff that night, actually, it was me voicing up 3 separate reports. So these kind of things were going on anyway. They've maybe come to the fore. I certainly think in terms of Twitter, which is the form of social media I know best, that there is a problem with this business of anonymity and people able to troll. I'm not necessarily in favour of completely stamping out anonymity, because I can see that in some situations in other countries or with whistleblowers that there might be a legitimate reason for it. But I would be in favour of a kind of scenario whereby they have a system called verification, and I think that should maybe be rolled out to a much larger portion of people who are prepared to provide proof of their identity. Because I don't necessarily mind any listener, any viewer intruding themselves into my personal timeline and telling me what they think of what I've said, but I'd rather that I knew what their name was and knew that they were a real person, because otherwise I may as well be having an argument with a lamppost.
Yeah. And I mean, what about the public discourse, though? I mean, that most people feel that it has kind of gone downwards rather than upwards, that level of vitriol that people, the trolling, and politicians obviously face.
What I would say is that the visibility of it has gone probably upwards rather than downwards, but I don't think we should think there was a good old days. There's the old... Yeah. And the joke, I think it was the Whole of War gang, the good old days when we all left our door open and somebody came in and shot you. There was a lot of vitriol out there, and we heard it on the streets, and we knew that this was going around. It's just that we didn't maybe hear it on such a daily basis. But I think there are horses for courses, and if people don't like either the Knowledge or Twitter or whatever it is, then they can vote with their feet and go to other forms of discourse, which do exist.
Go ahead.
I think, Tara, a pragmatic assessment is if you're to coexist with those realities, you have to learn how to participate in them and to acknowledge them. And if you're going to actually be successful, you have to learn how to use them.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at, say, political parties nowadays in terms of social media, the ones who are social media canny are the ones who are prospering.
Yeah.
And the ones who are dinosaurs are the ones who lose. It's probably the same. Like, Nolan isn't going to go away. I don't think the BBC is going to... They like the numbers he gets, and that seems to sort of influence their thinking. So that's how the world works these days.
Yeah. No, it's just going to move on to the B word, Ken, then. So Brexit. I mean, from your point of view, we were talking about this earlier, there felt like there was a period of some stability between the transfer of policing and justice, but something happened around June 2016 that seemed to shift the psyche of people in Northern Ireland and maybe change their perspective. How big a kind of issue do you think Brexit has been? We'll get to the protocol in a minute, but I mean the referendum vote itself.
Well, I think it was absolutely huge. I can't think of another event that has changed the political landscape as much. And the irony is that from each party, there was those that were comfortable with it. But for the DUP, for example, who had backed Brexit, and then people were saying, this is crazy. Everything has changed. And then parties trying to, perhaps not admitting they've made a mistake, but trying to claw back. And it does involve the protocol now.
Yes, Come on,
it changed everything.
Yeah.
And what it did, where the constitutional issue might have been sort of going into the background, people starting to get on with things, Northern Ireland, it became the number one issue. It still is now. And that's why this election is so important. It's coming. I think that the constitutional issue is going to dominate for some years to come.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessary. Brexit caused that.
And, was there a sense whenever you saw the kind of violence on the streets around Easter time this year, did that give you a sense of fear, upset? Do you think, right, that's still in the background here?
I didn't think the violence was too bad, actually. I mean, I thought it was a small area. And by accident, I actually came across a couple of demonstrations. I thought they were relatively small as well. But that did tap into fear, particularly in the working class unionism, that really they saw that they were being sold down the river. And I think then there was panic probably within unionism about, particularly the DP, well, what have we done? And that fear, and I do use the word fear, is still there. And that's why I think that this election campaign could be particularly unpleasant in many ways. And real pressure on the unionist parties.
Yeah, we've seen that this week with their joint statement. Tommy, what about you? Go back to 2016 and, it's interesting to see how North-South relations have changed and people along the border in particular perhaps being impacted by the choice of the UK, if you like, over Brexit, perhaps more than other people in Northern Ireland.
My Brussels years would influence my views. I thought Europe was an area that all sections of Northern Ireland society, and indeed people south of the border, had in common. And we were very comfortable in that space. And it was very positive in terms of the peace funds that came here and the pride that the EU took in Northern Ireland being the most successful peace process in its borders, in ongoing work. And when you look back on it, David Cameron called the referendum thinking he'd win it. Lots of the DUP hierarchy supported it in the belief that it would fail. It gave some activity to their own MPs in Westminster who were peripheral figures because of their numbers and whose soulmates were Eurosceptics. And And it was the storm that they invited upon themselves, but they didn't think would happen. And I think that since then, it has been a disaster. You look at the situation in Britain at the moment with the queues and the shortages and the absence of labour. You look at the British economy. You look at the impossible equation of the border down the Irish Sea or a border on the island of Ireland, or how do you pretend Brexit didn't happen or that it was going to be something benign? You look at the scab it has taken off the wound in terms of a border poll. And I think it has started just a process that is going to lead to people being asked questions about the future of the island, that they were prepared to let evolve slowly like stitches dissolving. But I think now it has ripped open the wound, and I think it's ongoing. And I worked with Boris Johnson in Brussels. I knew him when he was there with the Daily Telegraph. So I know his modus operandi.
Did you follow through on any of his stories, Tommy?
Well, I saw how he could sell them, Mark, and continues to sell them.
It was the bananas, wasn't it?
Yeah, lots of them. And he's very able character. But I don't think that this place had got the capacity to deal with the weight of the Brexit question. And like, if you look back to 1690, when Northern Ireland was just a piece in the European jigsaw, it became the cockpit, the battleground. And I think what Brexit has done is it has forced these very, very huge issues on a place that's really struggling with the weight of them.
How do you see it playing out?
If the person who mounted the campaign to get the Brexit result was Dominic Cummings, and if he's gone from the British government, and if he said in that very interesting Laura Kunsberg interview that no one can tell whether Brexit is going to be a success or not, how in God's name can I predict? You know, I thought it was a daft idea. I thought it would just bring boils to the surface and poison to the surface that wasn't necessary. So how do I think it will play out? I think there'll be a border poll within the next 10 years. And I think that'll be a very scratchy discussion. And I think brave people on all sides who just want to get on with their lives, I think they're being challenged in a way that had not occurred when the referendum was called. So I just think Ken is right. It's as seismic as the beginning of power sharing, as the IRA ceasefire, except it's political. And the one good thing I'd say, and when you asked about the violence, I think society's capacity to sustain a guerrilla warfare campaign where neighbour murders neighbour and slips off into the night. If you look at how that policeman was caught for murdering that woman in London, the amount of CCTV footage along the road, the shops where he bought his tape, place where he bought his diesel, you can't carry out that kind of campaign anymore. And that's one very encouraging thing about modern day society, that intelligence is such, intelligence gathering, cameras everywhere, that I don't think you could see the kind of troubles that we saw in the 70s and 80s.
One thing about, just going back to Dominic Cummings, which I think is quite important. I go back to March the 12th, 2019, the day before the RHI was reported. I was in Westminster. I had lunch. I was having lunch, and after coffee, I was with some ITV colleagues, and Dominic Cummings joined us. And I started, because he liked journalists, which was an amazing thing, talking away. And I sat talking to him for the best part of an hour. The man was an English nationalist. He couldn't care less about this place. This was the guy who was running Downing Street at the time. He couldn't care less about this place or Scotland. He said what they needed to do was they needed to win the north of England. Hence, being fair to Cummings, the result in the following general election where they captured the north of England. That was Mum Olam's old constituency. I remember going to Redcar to do a documentary on Mum Olam before she became Secretary of State. I couldn't believe how run down the place was. It was boarded up shops, it was poverty and so forth. No way. They now have a Conservative MP. I mean, I find that quite amazing. And I still think that the force that's underestimated in the United Kingdom at the moment is English nationalism. It's a very strong force. And that's a problem thus for unionists. particularly those who backed Brexit.
Yeah, ironically. Mark, what about you?
Well, in relation
On
to Brexit,
Brexit, yeah.
I would concur with Tommy that I think that the DUP thought that they would get a free ride. You'll have to remember that the referendum fell just after Arlene Foster had taken over as the new leader, and I think she felt that if Sammy Wilson, Ian Paisley Jr. and others were vociferous about this, fine, let them go out and campaign, and David Cameron will probably win the election anyway, you know? So they're wrestling to that extent here locally with something which they didn't think, in terms of, I think, the officials at the top level of the DUP didn't think that they would have to wrestle with. Having said that, numerically, it actually probably would not have made any difference if all the parties from here had opposed Brexit. It would still have gone through just on the basis of the votes from England. It has been a problem because, as we were saying earlier, John Hume was the man who really came up with the plan that then was put into practice. And it doesn't really matter, you know, what the text of the Good Friday Agreement or the text of the Northern Ireland 1998 Act does or does not say about trade in the EU. And the truth is that it doesn't say anything really. But the plan of making the border mean less and less and building in more and more North-South cooperation and East-West cooperation was within that context of the EU as a supranational entity, which would allow for the ease of this kind of cooperation. So it's a bit like he came up with the sticking plaster and we've kind of ripped the sticking plaster away. How do we cope with it? With great difficulty, because it has really fractured that relationship between Dublin and London, which, you know, when it was working so well in '98, in the era of Blair and Ahern, you know, you couldn't get a tissue paper between them. And we talked about the importance of the USA. There were some points when John Major was the Prime Minister, when the USA came in and was effectively taking sides with Dublin and with the SDLP against John Major, and that was the cause of tension. That was all over Gerry Adams' veto. But really, from the time that Tony Blair came in, you had the USA coming in and backing up what was already a united stand between Dublin and London. So the scenario now is, if the USA comes in, it has to work out whose side is it going to take, because there isn't a united stand. And, you know, I think it will be, it does make things difficult, not totally impossible. There may well be future Julian Smith type characters who can come up, or Blair type characters, or Peter Hain type characters who can come up with sort of clever compromises around some of this. But at the moment, it's not looking great, and it brings to the fore all of those arguments about, you know, the future status of Northern Ireland, whether it's better off within the EU rather than in the UK. And I would imagine that nationalists will posit it that way. It completely changes that dynamic of a border poll, which we would all have expected would be whenever it was held between a united Ireland and the UK, to instead this more diffuse notion of return to the EU, which is more appealing, I would have thought, to the floating voters in the middle ground.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it has been disruptive. It's been pushed, I agree with Ken, mainly by English nationalism. And the interesting thing is that the way that the debate was held, you know, the 350 million on the bus, you know, should we really be, you know, spending so much money on the EU, is kind of a way of just simply looking at these big decisions as, oh, what's in it for us?
Yeah.
And if English nationalism turns to Northern Ireland and is minded to ask what's in it for us, it's not necessarily a very straightforward answer.
Yeah. And do you see a border poll in 10 years, like Tommy?
Potentially, yes. You know, I did that documentary, the Spotlight program on the centenary in Northern Ireland, and in an opinion poll that formed part of that. I know there's a lot of arguments about the opinion polls, but most people felt that Northern Ireland would still be in the UK in 10 years' time, but a narrow majority thought it wouldn't in 25 years' time. So, you know, it's possible we could have a poll which could still turn out with a vote to stay in the UK, but then what will happen? It doesn't have to automatically be 7 years, but it would appear to be likely that it could be 7 years thereafter. And the problem there is that it poses a difficulty for stability, creating stability in this place, because You know, we've just seen the other day Alliance Party politicians being put on the spot with, where are you really green or are you really orange?
Yeah.
And all those people who just want the place to work will have to be answering that on a regular basis.
Yeah. I'm aware we don't have that much time and I want to just do a little bit more kind of personal stuff to end, but just want to ask you, David, about Brexit. And what do you think? Because I remember talking to civil servants before the referendum and they were saying, you know, like it couldn't possibly, I mean, it would take years to write the legislation to, you know, to remove ourselves. And here we are, you know, it did happen. So what impact do you think it's had on the civil service here?
It's had a huge impact, both in terms of the workload burden, but psychologically as well. Like I recall 2016, and when you think about it, the referendum came about a month after the Assembly elections, and the three minor parties had decided to go into opposition. So we had Sinn Féin and DUP. I felt slightly relieved that they weren't having to manage the three smaller parties, and that they were looking ahead to maybe an opportunity to work together and get some things done. I didn't sense that either two big parties thought the referendum would go the way it did. And when it did, there was just this sense of shock. And I recall I was actually on holiday at the time and I just couldn't believe it. But certainly immediately I came back and a group of us got together and we just thought, how are we ever going to tackle this? You know, and we got through that first summer on the basis of focusing in on the priority for Northern Ireland is we mustn't lose spending power. And it was quite easy to get the two parties to agree. And they squared up to the Chancellor effectively and said we need a guarantee that Northern Ireland will not be worse off, which they got, although it remains to be seen whether that will follow through. But then we went through that autumn, and obviously you had RHI and a variety of other things, and history shows the institutions collapsed. My experience in the 8 months before I retired, when the executive came back, was that Brexit was just almost too difficult for them to deal with. And, you know, it wasn't a thing that there were stand-up rows about. It was just, this is all too difficult. And it was almost as if we'll not take decisions because of the difficulty. But certainly it was a huge thing for the civil service staff to deal with. And we had to redivert literally hundreds of people into working and planning for Brexit and to dealing with the consequences of it at a time whenever the civil service had reduced by, I think, about 17% over the previous 5 years. And when you add on top of that the pandemic, my former colleagues are pretty exhausted just with the enormity of everything they've had to deal with. And it's not going to, I don't want this to be a really sort of downbeat conversation, but this is a huge issue and is going to remain such for some time to come.
I mean, I don't need to ask this question in some ways, Tommy, because it's so obvious that you're all still really interested and retirement hasn't led to you going and, you know, switching off the news and not bothering with the newspaper. But is it difficult to kind of step away and not be in the thick of those negotiations and the conversations and being on air on RTE every night?
Not really. You don't stop thinking. You don't lose affection for a place. Found listening to David there fascinating, getting those insights into the angst, the agonising that civil servants would go through. You can imagine the effort that it took to get that letter from Martin McGuinness and Arlene Foster in relation to Brexit. It was two-page letter, David. So that took an awful lot of time. One of the things, listening to him as well, one of the things I noticed while I was here was you could see the way society was changed by, factors that were taking place off the radar. Catholics getting involved in third-level education. Protestants maybe going across to university and not coming back. The number of Catholics in the civil service and the way its personality was influenced by that. It became a fairer place. It became a better place. It became a more robust place. So they're the kind of thoughts you get when you hear somebody like David talking. And, you just made conscious on an occasion like this, Tara, that this is such a vibrant place. Like, yes, it's troubled, but there is nowhere in Europe that I could think of that's more interesting than this place at the moment. So many responsibilities around the table. Little place, big picture. And then all the other little trends that are emerging. So I can see there sufficient meat to keep our minds exercised and to keep us having to adjust our thinking if we're to stay up to speed and relevant in how we analyse it. We've just talked about the homework and we talked about the agenda for the next while. And I think it's just a fascinating time to be alive. And you can't retire in those circumstances.
Yeah.
I think all three of us will be fascinated by this election that's
Yes,
coming, because I think, particularly for unionism, there's going to be big decisions to be made. Are they really going to walk away from Stormont when they've only 8 MPs at Westminster? Where's unionism going to get representation? Will it be another negotiation? Do they act? The problems in the Good Friday, not the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, they must stay, but the actual minutiae of it in terms of the detail, does that need to change? All those big questions are there, and I think what I'm looking for in this election will be obviously whether Sinn Féin will be the major party. And the danger, I know, talking to some people in unionism who still phone me, I don't know why, but they still phone me, is that, by saying the danger here is that Sinn Féin will be the main nationalist party, it could be a prophecy that really they shouldn't have made, because it could well take out even the middle Catholic ground who see the chance to have a nationalist first minister. So they need to be careful. The choice facing Jeffrey Donaldson's immense, absolutely immense. And at the moment, it appears to me, and I don't know whether Tommy and Mark agree, he's trying to face two ways. He's trying to take out the TUV support and also the softer, perhaps, alliance support that's growing. And I don't think he can do that with unionism. It'd be quite a trick if he pulls that off. I also think that the next 6 months will be difficult in the run-up to that election, because I think there'll be all sorts of scare stories and politicians are going to be asked big questions. But when it comes to the vote the next day, there's going to have to be, no matter what happens, there's going to have to be a lot of thinking. I mean, I was talking to somebody in the DUP, very senior, Wednesday. He was saying to me, this is a nightmare. I said, what do you mean? He said, life will go on, it'll be all right. He said, no. Just say Sinn Féin are in government in Dublin and they get the education portfolio, and at Stormont they get education. We'd have all Ireland education. I said, well,
Shock horror.
shock horror. You can't, demographics can't. This is the reality. People are going to have to make very significant choices, and it's going to be a strain on the politicians. What I do think, reflecting on my career, when politics works in this place, it works well. Now, I think there's been failures. Not particularly impressed at the moment, and perhaps new generation coming through, although I think that'll be slow enough. But our faith must be in politics. That's the one thing that I do believe in.
Mark, I'm really interested in your perspective on that, because I was going to ask you that, and you answered it without me even asking. I mean, the focus really, I know we've talked about Sinn Féin on an all-Ireland basis, but this is really about what unionists do now, isn't it? They have faced such significant challenges, whether it's, some people might see as a figurehead because it's a joint office anyway, but psychologically this big kind of potential Sinn Féin First Minister and DUP. Can you see them walking away? Do you think unionism across the kind of spectrum has it in them to go through this next stage, or do you think they'll bring everything down and we'll have a period of significant political instability in the run-up to a potential border vote?
Well, assuming that Sinn Féin was to be the biggest party, it's going to be very hard, particularly for the DUP, to be Deputy First Minister. It might be a different scenario if the Ulster Unionists were actually the biggest unionist party. We'll have to see. You can't write that off given the opinion polls for Doug Beattie. But I think, it's quite likely we'll go into a renegotiation because they will find it hard to swallow that. And, quite rightly, Sinn Féin will have the retort, why do you want to change the rules halfway through the game, you know? It's been unionists who have been vociferously, particularly the DUP, vociferously against any notion of suddenly going to joint first ministers. So why would you suddenly switch that? And Sinn Féin will either dig in their heels, or as they have done in the past, they will work out what can we get in return for this. And I'm sure that they'll have a little shopping list of what they will get in return for this. And the other interesting thing, though, is that if we do get into a renegotiation, how wide will that renegotiation be? And that's where we come back to what about the middle ground, which has not been well served by Stormont, the whole business of middle ground MLAs not having the same kind of votes in crucial decision making. And if we see a continuation of the sort of alliance green surge that we saw in some recent elections, then it may well be that we'll be at the sort of tipping point where we have to change the system. If alternatively that tails away, which is possible because Doug Beattie may well appeal to some of the soft unionists who were moving towards the alliance, then we may get a more limited negotiation around the first and deputy first minister situation. But yeah, I think that the position after the next election, which I assume will be in May, could be slightly before, but I don't think that's likely, is going to be potentially very fraught. And to answer your other question, which we all ignored earlier on, as to whether we're still interested, well, you can see that we're still interested.
I don't even need to ask.
But what I would put in is a caveat that, I mean, I can be done under the Trades Descriptions Act here for two elements in the title to this meeting, because not only am I not a giant, as anyone can see, but I haven't quite hung up my microphone. But what in as much as I'm still doing a wee bit of presentational work as well as doing stuff for the newspapers, but what I do like about the sort of change is that we can look at it a bit more from afar. We don't have to spend, and I'm assuming it's the same with you guys, every evening phoning around to find out what's the latest in the knowledge that will be being quizzed by yourself or one of the other presenters at 8 o'clock the following morning. So yeah, it's fascinating. I'll always remain a sort of a political animal with a small p.
Yeah.
But
running in the veins.
It runs in the veins. But if I can have a kind of a glide path, I think it was former Secretary of State once used that. Was it James Brokenshire? He had a glide path or something. If I can have a glide path about having to be across every single political dot and comma, then that's no bad thing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. And I mean, you're sorry,
if I
Tom.
can be provocative. I think it's getting to the stage where the big question is not about what unionists do.
Okay.
I think they're moving into that space. It's certainly the level of mistakes they might make or misjudgment they might make. But I think part of their dilemma is they're getting into the situation where they're not necessarily going to be the defining factor anymore.
Okay.
And then the problem shifts to how do you accommodate the reality of almost 1 million people of a unionist persuasion on this island. I think that's a different way of looking at things.
Yeah.
There was a time where, when they were the majority and when they had all the clout at Westminster, yes, that was the case. But if I'm reading things correctly, I think that's beginning to shift.
Yeah. And there's big questions for people in the South in that scenario as well, about how people in the South accommodate unionists in any potential future United Ireland.
Yeah, and like David talked about the dilemmas of civil servants, wondering how in God's name do you accommodate policy with a Brexit perspective in there. So can you imagine what it's like for civil servants on both sides of the border now saying, how do we work in this border poll United Ireland stuff? Like, if you look at our health services, the NHS model up here is in meltdown. South of the border, 45% of the people have private insurance.
Right.
And I wouldn't say that they like that system, but they know how to work it. And at the moment, the authorities in Dublin are struggling big time with attempting to begin the journey to establishing a single-tier health service. People resigning, in numbers from the bodies that were overseeing the efforts to change that. So these are the kind of practical issues that are now coming to the surface for David's equivalent south of the border as well. And whether we like it or not, we can trace the acceleration of that stress back to Brexit.
Yeah. 5 minutes left, couple of quick fire. Ken, when it comes to looking back over your career, and I mean, I can only imagine the amount of time that you spent, you know, never mind the office hours, everything else, the travel, you know, how were you able to kind of keep up that resilience and keep up that level of work? You know, with family at home, obviously you've had health issues now in the last couple of years as well. How have you been able to kind of just get through all of that?
I've reflected a lot on that recently. I mean, I would admit I think I missed a lot of my children growing up because I was constantly travelling, and Mark and Tommy were all the same. You know, it was really, if you got 8 hours sleep, that was a bonus. So really at the height of this stuff in the 90s, and everybody thought after the Good Friday Agreement, well, your job will be much easier. You'll go to Stormont and you'll be 9 to 5. Well, it wasn't, of course. There was crisis after crisis. And perhaps it comes down to the fact that we're all junkies. And I loved every minute of it. But I do realise that perhaps at times I didn't get my priorities absolutely right. And there's no question about that. I do have health problems at the moment. But, you know, you put them, you address them, and I've had great support from my colleagues here and others, fantastic. You get on with life, you know. Get up in the morning, check them, or make sure you're still there and get on with it.
Tommy, sorry, Ken. Tommy, any advice for your younger self?
I wouldn't change a day of it.
Really?
It was living the dream, being trusted, being paid. You do it for nothing. It wasn't a job, it was a life. Thing about it, Tara, and be careful, you, on this, it flies past. One day you're young and the next day you're old. For people to trust you, and then, of course, the big fear you have is that you'll make such a bad screw up that you'll be finished. And to get out, you know, without a dagger in your back or without a wanted poster, you know.
And do you think, was there something about your upbringing? Is it something in yourself, that resilience? And you've obviously had an even longer kind of fight with your ill health than Ken has had. But, you know, what do you think that kind of steely personality that has been able to kind of get through all of the challenges?
Deadlines are wonderful things. You know, when you have a deadline, you just got to get on and do it. And in terms of living with cancer, I found that work was just a perfect distraction, because if you had an acre of pain, you just had to get over it and get on with the job. But the most beautiful thing about it, Tara, is that people trust you. Like all the big stuff, it's great, all the big events and so on. But the real test is whether you connect with, you know, the ordinary people, the licence payers in RTE's case. Because if you're not doing your job, you'll be found out and they'll tell you.
Yeah. Well, I think we saw that with all three of you, the outpouring whenever, you know, you did retire. Mark, I know you haven't fully retired, but, you know, your younger self, you know, I mean, I saw firsthand, I mean, it's phenomenal, the amount of work. But the level of work, I mean, you were on call for every programme from the start of the day to the end of the day. And there were periods when it went on for months and years. And, you know, the rest of us, I have to say, looked on in awe and thought, how does he keep going? You know, how did you do it?
You're in the hamster wheel and you just have to keep going. I think, you know, the next deadline is important. But, you know, there were a couple of times when I was sort of coming close to giving out. I certainly know during the Drum Creek crisis, was that 96 or 97? Basically the year that it was really bad. I think I was going almost slightly insane, and I realised actually that if you have that amount of sleep deprivation working through the night consistently for a period of time, then you're going to lose your judgment. I think I kind of like tried to determine to take a couple of days back. But yeah, I mean, there were some moments. There was one of the times in Washington when I think it was around the time of crashes between the USA and John Major's government, and I was getting no sleep. I actually ended up going down with a bout of shingles, which was, I suppose, through the stress of the work. And there's a long version of this anecdote. I'll give you the short version of the anecdote, but I was desperately in need of a doctor in order to prescribe the necessary medication. I knew exactly what I wanted. And I was trying to find a doctor, and the head of the bureau in Washington was married to Maxine Mawhinney, who's a journalist from here, obviously very well-known Northern Ireland journalist. And she said, look, I'll try and find you a doctor. And then I got this phone call. I've got a doctor who'll see you. He's a gynecologist, but he does men too. Which is how I ended up finding myself in the Well Women's Centre in Washington. And I fortunately did, after a certain amount of tube throwing, get the prescription for the medicine I needed, and I kept going. But,
glad to
so
hear
yeah,
it.
there are
Lord.
times where you do get worn down by it all, but it's an immense privilege. I mean, I can recall doing stories on farms and having farmers say, that's a good, clean job you've got there.
Yeah.
And, you're doing a job which does not involve heavy physical labour, doesn't involve wallowing around in the mud too much. You've got to be up on points.
Oh, very good. And David, just the same question to you. You've retired as well. What would you say to your younger self, in the thick of the civil service, all of that time in your career?
Don't do it. No. I joined the civil service and I didn't really know what it was I wanted to do. And in many ways, even when I retired, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. It was just I took opportunities that came along. But the resilience point is a really important one. And I certainly advice I would give to my younger self and indeed to former colleagues is you've got to look after yourself. You're not much use to anybody if you're so exhausted that your judgment drops. And I think you do, when you're in a senior position, you have to be a bit of a role model. So you have to show that, you have a work-life balance. And in doing so, then other people recognize that, well, it is important. But certainly for me, I didn't really appreciate all the stress of the job until I stopped doing it.
Right.
And, it's only then you suddenly realize the pressure you're under. And, I can actually see it, and I sleep better, my blood pressure's lower. There's a lot of physical things come with stress. And I think it's really important that we all do look after ourselves.
I think we've got, 1.5 minutes. Each other's legacy. Ken, what do you think Tommy's legacy is?
The ability to communicate with people and people to trust them.
Absolutely. Tommy, Mark.
He's just a good guy. It's very hard to go through life in our trade without making enemies. It's one of the really unusual things about Northern Ireland journalism. There's a lot of conflict out there. You're reporting on rows a lot of the time, but people were very decent to each other. We're all delighted that, say, Jerry Moriarty, after major heart surgery, makes it to the finishing post alive today. We're all thinking of Stephen Grimison and the struggles he's going through. And I found with these guys, Ken was telling me today about a stroke he had in May. So I'm thrilled that he's above ground. Mark was telling me about a little procedure he had, which we won't go into, which you can imagine.
It's a gynecologist again, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like, some people would say not table talk, but he came through it, and he can still sing in a high-pitched voice. That's what I'd say about these fellas, that even though you always want to try to be first and you always want to try to be best, but these fellas would never see you embarrassed by not having a story. And that's
tremendous.
That's what I think is
that
legacy.
is really incredible. Mark, what about you for these two?
Well, Ken and sorry, I thought you were kind of doing. Ken has been a great competitor. He's often put the fear of God into me when I've been watching his 6 o'clock two ways. What's he got now? That I'm going to have to shuffle around and try and get there for 6:30. A good communicator is very good at building up trust with our most senior politicians and getting scoops that way. Tommy's got a track record of getting scoops, and I remember Tommy turning up, and normally he would have the communique for the meeting that we were covering before it had been issued. By the way, do you want to see what they're going to say afterwards, lads? That's more than once that Tommy actually did that for me.
That's because we'd make it up for them.
And you know, I can pay no greater tribute to Ken than I never thought I'd be friends with an Everton fan. But you know.
Well, the Liverpool thing's a problem for me. Yeah, our friendship goes back. I remember 1995 with Mike Nesbitt coming back from Washington in a disastrous trip home that took 24 hours.
Oh my goodness.
We got to know each other quite well.
Yeah, we had a long time there.
Yeah, airport stops.
Mike was our shop steward back in those days. He was the one who was going to get us moved from economy to luxury class at the front of the plane, and he failed, but he tried. He tried again, and then when we got put on the last of about 7 different planes that we were on in that journey, the air hostess in a Glenn Gormley accent or something said, "Oh, Mike, how are you doing?" He went, "You're just the person I've been looking for."
Fantastic.
We ended up in first class.
Brilliant.
Can I give you a local version of Mark's story of receiving medical attention in the United States? I was covering an election here once, and I get an injection every 28 days. It's like petrol to keep me going, and my injection was due, and I had no arrangements made. So I did a deal with Alistair MacDonald. An injection for a vote.
You got to do what you got to do. Oh, I mean, I just wish the audience was able to kind of clap alongside me, but thank you so much. That was really fantastic. We could have talked on all day, but I'm aware of the clock, and I'll hand back over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. Thanks for managing that session really well. And like you, I just thought that was a privilege to be here for the last hour and a half.
Yeah.
And you just a wonderful opportunity just to listen to the three guys' stories. Reflect back on where we've come from and look ahead as well. So I realise we're over time, but just huge thanks to all three of you. That has been absolutely fantastic. And I say it will be on tape, so people will be able to watch it again.
Thanks, guys.